Hi guys, this is a video about England's third lockdown and the disgraceful events that caused it. You probably don't know what caused the third lockdown. You probably think it had something to do with protecting the NHS or stopping the spread or a new variant of COVID. Actually, the truth is diabolical. The third lockdown was one of the most scandalous events in British history. And the biggest scandal is, hardly anyone is aware of what actually happened. I've created this video partly because I want people to understand the truth. But also I believe that if the public understood the truth about the third lockdown, the corona panic debacle would end immediately in Britain. All of it. All the COVID measures everywhere would be immediately rescinded. The whole pointless debacle from March 2020 to the present would be seen for the terrible crime that it is. That's quite a big claim, isn't it? So let's back it up by addressing the question, what caused the third lockdown? To give the answer, I need to give some context. The background of the third lockdown was the government trying to reopen schools in early January 2021. A tier system was in place whereby some areas of England were under harsher COVID measures than others. The government initially tried to reopen schools in 10 London boroughs where it was deemed safe to do so. However, 8 of the 10 councils were Labour-led and they joined forces with the National Education Union to lobby the government not to reopen the schools. The government backed down and announced that all schools in London would remain closed. However, having failed in those 10 London boroughs, the government didn't give up. They turned their attention to reopening schools throughout the rest of England. The plan was to reopen all primary schools on January the 4th, with secondary pupils gradually returning in the days and weeks afterwards. Boris Johnson tried to allay people's fears about children returning to school. On January the 3rd, he went on national TV and he said, "There's no doubt in my mind that schools are safe." Also on January the 3rd, Gavin Williamson, the Education Secretary, wrote in the Daily Mail, "We must all move heaven and earth to get children back to the classroom." So the government was committed to reopening schools. What happened next caused the lockdown. The same day that Boris went on TV to announce that the schools are safe, an astonishing event took place, which meant that the government had no hope whatsoever of carrying out its plan. The National Education Union, the same union that had lobbied to keep the schools closed in London, was again hell-bent on defying the government. The NEU is the largest teaching union in Britain, with over 450,000 members. On January the 3rd, the NEU convened an online Zoom meeting to discuss the prospect of schools reopening outside of London. 400,000 teachers and members of the public attended this online meeting. Yes, you heard that correctly. I'll say it again. On January the 3rd, 400,000 people attended a Zoom meeting held by the National Education Union. At the meeting, the NEU's executive issued some clear advice that it would be unsafe for teachers to return to their classrooms. According to one local branch of the NEU, the executive also said that teachers should invoke health and safety legislation so as to defy the government and shut down schools unilaterally. This is astonishing. Not only was it the biggest trade union meeting in history, it was also one of the biggest ever teaching mutinies in Britain. How could the government reopen schools if the teachers didn't want to work? And worse, the NEU wasn't the only teaching union that wanted the schools to stay closed. On January the 2nd, the National Association of Head Teachers had called for the government to delay the reopening of all schools. The NAHT also recommended that head teachers should take no action against staff who felt too unsafe to return to work. And another teaching union, the NASUWT, on the same day had likewise called for remote learning. Since late December, they'd been calling for schools to remain closed until the spring. So what happened? Well, the government pushed ahead with the reopening on January the 4th, but there must have been chaos in the schools, given that the teaching unions were opposing the reopening, and especially given that the day before, the NEU had advised hundreds of thousands of teachers that it wasn't safe for them to return to work. By the evening of January the 4th, the government was in panic mode. Opening the schools without the cooperation of the teaching unions was never going to prove viable, so the government had a choice: admit that the teachers were refusing to work, or lie to cover it up. The government chose to lie. On the evening of January the 4th, Boris Johnson suddenly announced a new national lockdown. Unbelievable. It was an extraordinarily cynical political move, an attempt to rapidly shift the narrative to avoid disclosing that the teachers had defied the government. No politician wants to admit that their authority has been undermined by a massive public sector mutiny, but still the gall of the lockdown announcement was breathtaking. Only 24 hours before, the government had assured the public that the schools are safe. Now the whole country was being plunged into lockdown for no reason other than teachers refusing to work and the government refusing to be honest about it. In his announcement, Boris made a ham-fisted attempt to justify his sudden U-turn. He said, "There is no doubt that in fighting the old variant of the virus, our collective efforts were working, but now we have a new variant of the virus." And he talked about the speed with which the new variant is spreading. Well, how convenient and how very speedy. 24 hours before, our efforts were apparently working. But then the teachers refused to work and suddenly there was a new variant of the virus that was spreading so fast that we needed to do a national lockdown. Like I said, the gall of this announcement was breathtaking. I urge you to watch it in full. You can find it on YouTube. But I don't want to focus my criticism solely on the government. The fact is the government was trying to reopen the country, but they couldn't reopen the country if the schools weren't open. If the teachers refused to return to work, the government was in a very difficult position. Presumably Boris feared being hounded from power if he tried to stand up to the teachers. Whether that fear was justified or not, I don't know. What I do know is that after this mendacious lockdown had started, the teachers continued causing trouble. The government formed a new plan to reopen the schools on March the 8th. However, on February the 19th, 9 teaching unions issued a press release saying that the government's plan was reckless. In the end, the government managed to persuade the teachers to return to work on March the 8th, but only by making a horrible new concession. Several teaching unions had demanded that the children be masked in classrooms. The government caved in, and Britain witnessed the appalling spectacle of school children being forced to wear stifling, dehumanising face masks for hours upon end in school. It was mass child abuse, be in no doubt about that. The teachers also continued to cause problems for the whole country. Even after the schools had reopened, the government shied away from reopening the whole economy because the teachers were obsessed with the infection rate throughout the country. There might have been another teaching mutiny if the lockdown had ended sooner. Boris didn't reopen Britain fully until July the 19th, which was the week the school term ended. In his Freedom Day announcement, when he scrapped all the COVID laws, he said that with the schools closed, the summer holidays were a natural fire break. Go figure. Now, I'm sure you can appreciate that this is a big scandal. The third lockdown lasted over 6 months, causing untold damage and suffering. And the reason the lockdown started and lasted so long was because of mutinous teachers. Let me make this point super clear. The third lockdown wasn't about the government following the science. The official science had led the government to say that the schools were safe. And the teaching unions weren't following the science either. If they had followed the science, they would have cooperated with the government and teachers would have returned to work on January the 4th instead of forcing the lockdown and then only agreeing to return to work if they could force the kids into masks. The English public and the nation's school children were dragged into a nightmare because of a teaching mutiny and a government that lied instead of admitting what had really happened. That is the reality of the third lockdown. There was no need for the lockdown. The lockdown only happened because teachers refused to work and the government locked down rather than telling the truth to the public. If the teachers had cooperated with the government, the third lockdown wouldn't have happened. And I'm afraid to say, folks, this is only the tip of an iceberg of trouble that the public sector has caused since the corona panic began. I said that the events of the third lockdown have the potential to unravel the entire corona panic debacle. Why? Because from the start, every single escalation of the debacle has involved a public sector union making demands or threats to the government and the government caving in. The whole thing has been driven by the public sector, not by the government. Indeed, the villains of the third lockdown, the National Education Union, were heavily involved in the circumstances of all 3 lockdowns. You could make a good case that all 3 lockdowns were caused by the NEU. Now, I've gone into detail about all this in another video, the unions and the corona panic. So here I'll just provide a brief overview of some of the key events. I'll start with the first and second lockdowns. The first lockdown happened in March 2020. Following the advice of his chief scientist, Boris had spent the first few weeks of March pursuing a herd immunity strategy. However, gradually the government caved in and started imposing restrictions on the public. Much of the pressure came from the public sector. When Boris banned mass gatherings on March the 13th, he admitted that he wasn't following scientific advice. He said he was trying to avoid placing a burden on public services. By the middle of the month, vulnerable people were being asked to shield and the public was being asked to stay at home. This was, we were told, to protect the NHS. not to protect the public, to protect the NHS. Again, policy was being driven by the public sector. But it's really important to note that there was no lockdown, no legal stay-home order, no closing down most of the economy until a decisive intervention from the NEU. On March the 17th, 2020, the NEU called for the government to close all schools in Britain. The NEU threatened to support any heads who closed schools unilaterally. This was too much for the government. The very next day, Boris caved in and announced that all schools would close. Lockdown became inevitable because you can't keep the country open unless the schools are open. On the day the schools shut, Friday the 20th, the government announced that most of the economy was shutting. The lockdown was officially announced on Monday the 23rd, the first day that the schools weren't open. And that was only the start of the shenanigans from the teachers. The first lockdown lasted as long as it did because numerous teaching unions refused to return to normal working conditions. It wasn't until July the 17th, the day after the school term would have ended, that the first lockdown ended. Just like the third lockdown, Boris waited until he wasn't going to get into a confrontation with teachers before he reopened the country. So that was the first lockdown, caused by the NEU. And what about the second lockdown? Well, it happened in circumstances that aren't well understood. But again, the NEU was heavily involved. There are suggestions that Boris was reluctant to lock down a second time and that he was bounced into it by a press leak. He also seems to have been bounced into it by another NEU demand. The leadership of the NEU wanted what they called a circuit breaker, a 2-week half-term to get the infection rate down throughout the country. The government didn't back down immediately and the schools reopened after half-term as usual. But at the end of the first week back on November the 5th, the government suddenly announced 2 major escalations. From the next week, children would be forced to wear masks in corridors, a cruel measure that had been demanded by numerous teaching unions, including the NEU. And also from the next week, the whole of England would go into lockdown. The idea was for schools to stay open while everyone else was locked up for a month to get the infection rate down. I think it's reasonable to assume that the 2 measures were designed to keep the NEU on side and keep the schools open. It's notable that in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, there were second lockdowns explicitly based on the NEU's circuit breaker concept. It's also notable that in all 4 home nations, the first lockdown started on the same date. There was also rough alignment between the third lockdowns in each of the 4 home nations. At the start of January, the schools were closed and there were national restrictions in place across Britain. Presumably all these commonalities stem from the fact that the NEU covers the whole of Britain. In this video, I've talked mainly about policy in England, but it seems likely that the NEU had a hand in all 3 lockdowns in all 4 home nations. And it wasn't just the lockdowns that were driven by public sector demands or threats. Let me tell you about 2 further episodes that will astonish you. You'll know that in the summer of 2020, face coverings became mandatory on public transport in England. But you probably don't know that this mandate was preceded by a threat from the Rail Workers Union, the RMT, which has 80,000 members. On May the 18th, the RMT called for mandatory face masks on trains in England. The union's General Secretary, Mick Cash, threatened strike action if the government didn't comply with the demand. At the same time, another union, Unite, was calling for masks on all public transport, specifically mentioning buses and trams. And lo and behold, the government caved in. Despite ministers and officials having previously stated that masks weren't necessary for general public use, suddenly masks were mandated on public transport from June the 15th onwards. This wasn't about following the science, it was about following the RMT. You'll also remember that in the summer of 2020, masks were mandated in shops. But again, you probably don't know that this mandate was preceded by pressure from a large union. In this case, it was the Union of Shop, Distributive and Allied Workers, USDAW, with 400,000 members. USDAW had spent months lobbying the government for mandatory masks, social distancing, one-way systems, separate entrances and exits and cleaning stations in shops. The British Retail Consortium also threw its weight behind USDAW's demands. The 2 unions joined forces to compile a submission to the government about how the retail sector could reopen without any threat of industrial unrest. The government ultimately caved in. Mandatory masks in shops were announced in mid-July, coming into force on July the 24th. This wasn't about following the science. It was about following the retail unions. So I hope you're beginning to see the pattern. Every major escalation of the corona panic debacle was driven by the public sector. Let's recap chronologically. The first lockdown came when the NEU threatened unilateral schools closures if the government didn't close all schools. The masks on public transport mandate came from a strike threat by the RMT, and the masks in shops mandate came from pressure from Usdaw. The second lockdown came when the NEU demanded a circuit breaker. And the third lockdown came when 400,000 people attended an NEU Zoom meeting at which the executive advised teachers not to return to work. The next day, January the 4th, when the schools were due to reopen, the government panicked and announced a national lockdown rather than confronting the teaching mutiny. I could go on, providing more examples of unions pressuring the government and the government caving in. For instance, in December 2020, the BMA pressured the government into imposing tougher COVID restrictions over Christmas. In January 2021, the UCU, the academic union, threatened to strike if the government reopened universities properly. The government caved in. And it's highly likely that the BMA and the NHS have pressured the government to implement mandatory COVID passes. From the start of the corona panic debacle to the present, unions have pressured the government and the government has caved in. However, in this video, I focused on the third lockdown because it's the most vivid and clear example of the general pattern. When it comes to all the other escalations, some people will argue that the government would have implemented the measures anyway. Some people will argue that the unions pushed at an open door. But you cannot make that argument when it comes to the third lockdown. No way in a million years did the government want to close the schools and lock the country down on January the 4th, 2021. You cannot get more categorical than what the PM said. There is no doubt in my mind that schools are safe. Or what the Education Minister said. We must all move heaven and earth to get children back to the classroom. The third lockdown is categorical evidence of a government being pressured by the public sector and then caving in and lying about it, with the whole country being dragged into hell as a consequence. And if this could happen once, we're entitled to assume it happened throughout the corona panic debacle, from the start to the present, especially when so much evidence points towards that scenario. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine if you knew for a fact that a murderer had killed someone in a basement, and then you found other bodies in the same basement killed in the same way. You'd be entitled to assume that the same murderer had committed all these crimes. Well, the same goes for the corona panic debacle. We know that the third lockdown was a sham. It was utterly unnecessary from a scientific point of view. It was a politically motivated spin operation. It was a needless atrocity caused by a public sector union blackmailing the government and the government caving in. We also know the other two lockdowns and the various mask mandates, masks on trains, masks in shops, masks in schools, bear the same hallmarks as the third lockdown. We're entitled to conclude that government policy on all these occasions was a sham, that the public sector has driven every major escalation throughout the whole corona panic debacle. When you understand all this, you see the whole thing in a completely different light. At the start of March 2020, Boris was boasting about shaking hands with people in a hospital where there were coronavirus patients. He and his scientific advisors spent the first 2 weeks of March telling us that COVID-19 is a mild illness for most people, including most vulnerable people. We were told to wash our hands, to keep on keeping on. That was it. Then all hell broke loose because the public sector, especially the National Education Union, went ballistic and started making demands and threats. From then on, we've had a hostage government. Every escalation of the corona panic debacle has happened because ministers were carrying out the wishes of public sector unions. There would have been no corona panic debacle at all if the government hadn't been blackmailed into it by public sector unions. In this light, you can also see a government that's been trying to fight back, albeit without telling the full truth, because the full truth would cause a political earthquake. We've seen a government engaging in legal battles with local authorities and teaching unions, a government scrapping all the COVID laws on Freedom Day, a government delaying the introduction of COVID passes, and a government secretly planning Operation Rampdown. The government has been pushing back against the corona panic debacle, not driving it. Yet the government has also been colluding in the debacle. Whenever the PM doesn't believe he can win a fight against the unions, he caves in, and then he continues trying to push back without telling the full truth. This may sound paradoxical, but that's the reality of the situation. Even the government's threat to vaccinate all NHS workers could be seen as a manipulative attempt to stop the NHS from forcing a lockdown this winter. It's as though the government is saying to the NHS, if you try to force a lockdown, we'll decimate your workforce. Of course, this would be damaging to both sides, but that doesn't mean the government's threat won't work. The government is fighting coercion with coercion. And as for Plan B, well, it's clearly the plan of a hostage government. Ministers know full well that they might cave in again to the public sector at any point. Yet despite this, the government is probing constantly for an exit and fighting dirty in the process. What a mess. Public sector socialists are trying to drive us further into corona panic madness, and the government is trying to extract us from the madness without telling the full truth. The government never wanted any of this to happen, but as soon as they had caved in at the start, they were trapped in lies, and the only way to escape was to spin their way out. This also explains why the whole establishment has been gripped by vaccine mania. The government sees the vaccines as a way to draw a line under the corona panic debacle without telling the full truth, while the doctors see the vaccines as a way to make money. It's like a pincer movement, with both sides peddling vaccine propaganda, while the British public is trapped in the middle being treated like collateral. Only the truth will set us free. People need to understand that none of this madness was ever necessary. The public sector forced the madness upon the government, and the government forced the madness upon us all. But here we come to the deepest problem. Very few people want to talk about the real dynamics of the corona panic debacle. Even lockdown skeptics are avoiding the issue. Among lockdown skeptics, the conversation is being led by journalists who insist on holding the government solely responsible for the whole debacle. As far as I know, there's not a single mainstream lockdown skeptic journalist who is talking about the role of the unions in driving the debacle. And most amazingly of all, I'm not aware of a single mainstream lockdown skeptic journalist who has ever mentioned the most brazen example of the unions running amok, the teachers forcing the third lockdown. This monumental episode has been hushed up like it never happened, like the Tiananmen Square massacre in China. I repeat, the NEU held a Zoom meeting with 400,000 attendees, and the resulting teaching mutiny strong-armed the government into committing a monstrous crime against the British people. A 6-month hellscape, an ocean of suffering, and not a single journalist has ever talked about the real causes of the third lockdown. What on earth is going on? Well, maybe some of the journalists were duped by the government's dishonest announcement about the third lockdown. But that can't be the full story. The journalists can't be that obtuse. I think something very dark is going on with these journalists. While the government was being monstered by the public sector in March 2020, almost all the lockdown skeptic journalists either supported the lockdown or they kept their heads down. Maybe if the journalists had stuck up for freedom at the start, the government would have stood up to the public sector at the start. But the journalists didn't stick up for freedom, and the episode reflects badly on them. As a result, they've never wanted to talk about the government caving into the public sector. They've studiously avoided the topic all the way through the corona panic debacle. Instead, they've vilified the government and the government alone, as though Boris never tried to pursue herd immunity, never lacked support and never caved in. The journalists are like soldiers who hid in a trench while their general ran over the top, and then when the general inevitably surrendered, they called him a traitor. It's deeply, deeply bogus, and it's doing great harm to Britain. The public sector has been getting away with monstering the government throughout the corona panic debacle because lockdown skeptic journalists won't talk about what has been happening. The journalists must swallow their pride and start telling the truth. They need to talk about the public sector monstering the government. They need to properly investigate the circumstances that led to every escalation of the corona panic debacle. What exactly happened between the public sector and the government? We need to know. And especially the journalists need to talk about the third lockdown, this most brazen example of the dishonesty and pointlessness of the entire corona panic debacle. Let me say it again. The third lockdown has the potential to unravel the whole nightmare of the last 20 months. When the public understands that they were duped in January this year, that they've been duped from the start and all the way through, they will demand that sanity is restored to this country in full. A complete reversal of every single lunatic COVID restriction that still blights this land. Restrictions on visiting relatives in hospitals and care homes, vax mandates for care home workers, mass testing, isolating, vax passes, travel restrictions, mask mandates, signs, posters and instructions relating to COVID, incessant updates on cases, deaths and hospitalisations, perspex screens, one-way systems, social distancing, TV celebrity social distancing, every other chair taped off, every other urinal taped off, masked police officers, hand sanitizer everywhere, cult-like rainbow signs thanking the NHS, little circles on the floor telling you where to stand, traffic lights at shop entrances, working from home, parents' evenings and medical consultations held online, masks at the dentist, test and trace, maximum admission numbers due to COVID, cancelled events, cancelled gigs, cancelled religious services, the Coronavirus Act, repeal it in its entirety, GPs hiding in their surgeries, ridiculous OTT cleaning regimes, restrictions in universities, stop blighting the lives of students, all COVID measures in schools, bubbles, testing, isolation, masks, social distancing, screens, all of it, every single measure in schools. Stop tormenting these beleaguered children. And not just in schools. Scrap every COVID measure throughout Britain. Get rid of it all. None of it was ever needed. All of it has been an abomination. And the ultimate abomination was the third lockdown. Cowardly socialist teachers refused to return to work, and the government locked us all in our houses as a spin operation to avoid confronting the teachers. Tell the truth about the third lockdown. Tell the truth about the whole corona panic debacle, the public sector monstering the government and the government caving in. Tell the truth, and we can start the process of holding all the culprits responsible. We can free our country from all this madness once and for all.